horror menu at fast food store. Alex was working the third shift at a local Wendy's to pay for his tuition. The job was nothing special, just the occasional late-night customer, making things a little more interesting. That night, he spent most of his shift sweeping and wiping down counters. Just as he thought he was going to die of boredom, a car pulled up to the drive-thru speaker. Alex set down his rag, put on his headset, and said,
"Welcome to Wendy's. What can I get for you?"
The car pulled up to the pickup window, and the order was unusually large, 50 chicken nuggets and 10 double cheeseburgers. Alex entered the order into the computer, feeling sorry for his coworker, Brad, who was the only cook on shift. Brad would have to make all of that food by himself. Alex asked if he wanted anything else, but the man remained silent and simply drove up to the window. A pickup truck. The man's vehicle was white, coated in a thick layer of grime on the windshield and windows, with patches of rust and dents. As the driver's window rolled down, Alex finally saw him. The man was unsettling. He had pale, sunken eyes with dark purple circles underneath. He was sweating and looked restless. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Strange scars ran down his arms, as if something had gnawed on his limbs. Alex tried not to stare and opened the window. A horrific stench wafted out from the truck, a smell like a rotting swamp. The man said nothing. He simply handed Alex a crumpled $50 bill. Alex took the money, trying to remain calm despite the man's scarred arms and the truck's overwhelming stench. One thing Alex had learned working in fast food was to avoid conflict at all costs. He handed the man his change and directed him to the designated waiting spot for large orders. Alex told him he'd bring the food out when it was ready, but the man just stared at him with those hollow eyes. Then, the man muttered something repeatedly. "Sandy is so hungry." Alex quickly told him the food would be ready soon and shut the window. But the man didn't move. He didn't park where Alex had directed him. Alex waited for Brad to start passing the food through the window. But after 5 minutes, Brad had only prepared 20 nuggets and 2 burgers. After a few minutes of waiting, he started knocking on the window, demanding his food. When Alex opened the window to check, the man insisted, "Sandy won't wait any longer." Alex could only nod, promising to hurry before quickly shutting the window. Less than 2 minutes passed before he knocked again. This time, he reached out, grabbed Alex by the collar, and snarled, "Sandy won't wait anymore. Do you want me to feed you to her?" Panicked, Alex shoved him away and demanded he leave. The man growled, jumped into his truck, and sped off into the night. About half an hour passed with no customers, so Alex and Brad sat in the kitchen, chatting. Suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, the power in the store cut out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Alex and Brad froze, turning toward the noise. He had come back. He stood at the window, no longer in his truck, this time clutching a large sack against his chest. His pale lips curled into a sickening smile. Then, to Alex's horror, he pushed open the window. "Sandy needs to eat." Brad lunged toward the window in rage. The man opened the sack and dumped its contents into the store. Something heavy and wet hit the floor with a sickening sound. Alex squinted, trying to make sense of it. The horrific sound sent chills down Alex's spine. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. What he saw would haunt him forever. It was an alligator. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws around Brad's ankle. Brad screamed in agony. The lunatic at the window giggled. "Sandy's hungry. Sandy's hungry," he repeated over and over. Alex grabbed a cast iron pan and swung it with all his strength at the alligator. It screeched and backed off for a moment. In a frenzy, Alex yanked Brad into the kitchen and slammed the door shut behind them. He dialed 911 as they waited in terror, the sound of claws scraping against the floor and the lunatic's distorted mumblings echoing outside. After 10 agonizing minutes, the police arrived and arrested the man. Yet he still wore that deranged, inexplicable grin. Animal control arrived a few minutes later, sedated the alligator, and transported it to a wildlife sanctuary. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man. The truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. The Hitchhiker's Trap. This happened in the winter of 1993, when Keely was 20 years old. It was 1:30 May, when Keely finished her shift at the factory and stopped at a gas station to fill up her smoking car. The gas station was nearly empty, except for a few cars parked in the distance. While Keely was pumping gas, a woman began approaching. She appeared to be around Keely's age, approaching with a frightened, distressed, and anxious look. The woman spoke hurriedly, out of breath. She said she had argued with her boyfriend and needed to use a payphone to call a friend for a ride. Keely listened, but her unease grew as the woman explained that she had been harassed and feared the men in a light green car parked next to the gas station's dumpster. Initially hesitant, Keely noted that the woman was dressed neatly and wasn't drunk or anything similar. She just seemed genuinely anxious and scared. So after finishing her refueling, Keely told her to get in the car. As they drove down a dark, quiet street, Keely asked where the woman lived. The woman kept glancing into the rearview mirror, fidgeting in her seat. She didn't answer Keely's question, just mumbled something incomprehensible. Then she asked Keely to take her to a house not far away on the edge of town. When they arrived, it looked unusual, almost abandoned. Keely asked skeptically, "You live here?" She simply told Keely the house was under renovation and asked her to wait outside for a moment. Keely reluctantly got out of the car and leaned on the hood. She called back, asking Keely to help her. Still trying to make sense of everything, Keely reluctantly agreed and approached the porch. However, as Keely neared the house, a sense of hesitation crept over her. Something about this house, and the woman felt off. Just as she reached out to touch the doorknob, a loud bang erupted behind her. Time seemed to freeze, and she felt a sharp pain at the back of her head. Everything spun as the pain surged, and the next thing she knew, she was collapsing onto the ground in front of the porch. Keely's vision blurred, but she could still see the woman standing over her with a smug smile. "Thanks for the help," she said, as darkness consumed Keely, punctuated by her chilling laughter. When Keely woke up, her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with rope. Her head throbbed with pain as she lay on the floor of a dark, filthy room reeking of mildew. Keely didn't dare move, but observed what was happening. The woman sat on a chair not far away, holding up her phone on a video call. "You should mind your own business," she said, not even glancing at Keely. Keely regained her vision and focused on the phone screen. It was a man standing next to a car, the same one she had seen at the gas station. He said he'd pick her up soon to catch more victims. She realized everything from the start had been a trap. Keely struggled against her restraints, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. Despite the pain, Keely, being the only woman at the plastic factory, had learned to handle such situations. She relied on her experience to quietly inspect and work on her restraints. Finally, the rope loosened slightly, but the woman began approaching Keely, so she decided to stay still, pretending nothing was amiss. When the woman seemed to sense something, she moved closer to Keely. The moment arrived, Keely sprang up, elbowing her in the face. She turned and kicked the woman hard with her bound feet, causing her to stumble painfully to the ground. That gave Keely the chance to free her legs and run outside. Keely dashed outside and got into her car. As she frantically started the engine, the woman suddenly appeared with a menacing smile. Somehow, she had gotten into Keely's car. "Mind giving me a ride?" Just as the car started, the woman, not wearing her seatbelt, was thrown forward as Keely hit the accelerator. Keely pushed the woman out of the car and drove off, calling the police to have them arrested. When Keely finally got home, she told her sister about the harrowing encounter. While relieved that Keely was safe, her sister scolded her for not going to the police immediately. After a few days of investigation, the police arrested the two criminals. Keely couldn't believe what had happened, but at least she had survived. And she learned a terrifying lesson about the hidden dangers in seemingly harmless situations. The Nightmare Delivery Trip. Ryan, a hard-working pizza delivery driver, had been working night shifts for 2 years. His job usually involved driving, delivering, and collecting payments. Most nights went smoothly, but one fateful night changed everything. Near midnight, Ryan received the final delivery order of his shift. The address was on the outskirts of town, near the industrial area, a place he had never delivered to before. The streets were eerily deserted, with most streetlights flickering or completely off. The place always gave him a sense of isolation, but Ryan assumed it was just another late-night delivery. He saw a small, rundown house that didn't scream danger. Yet, something felt off about the place. At the end of the driveway stood a tall man wearing a gray coat and jeans. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Ryan's car with an unsettling smile. Ryan hesitated but regained his composure, grabbed the pizza, and approached the man.
"Hey, here's your pizza,"
Ryan said, naming the price, but the man didn't rush to pay. Instead, the man slowly pulled out a handful of coins. He began counting them one by one, placing each coin into his other hand, as if performing some ritual. The air grew colder with each passing second. My fingers began to freeze around the pizza box. The man's grin widened as he said,
"You drive too fast, Ryan."
Ryan froze. How did he know his name? Panic surged through him.
What?
Ryan stammered.
I don't know you. I don't think we've met before.
Then Ryan quickly backed away. He hurried back to his car, started the engine, and drove off. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the man still standing there, holding the pizza and staring at him. But that wasn't the last time. A week later, near the end of his shift, Ryan's manager assigned him one final pizza delivery for the night, another strange order. The address was a house on the outskirts of town, near where he had gone before. The house he arrived at looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and peeling paint. A note was taped to the door, delivered to the basement. A chill ran down Ryan's spine. Delivering to a basement was unusual. Reluctantly, needing to finish the job, he decided to follow the instructions. As he approached the basement door, he hesitated. A loud creak sounded as he opened it, revealing a narrow, chilly staircase leading down. Something felt off.
Hello?
Ryan called, his voice trembling, but there was no response. At the bottom, the basement stretched into darkness, with several doors lining the walls. One door was slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. The small room was dimly lit by a single lamp. In the center of the room was a figure of a man, entirely sculpted out of wax. It was almost perfectly life-sized, like a real person. At first, Ryan thought it was some kind of artwork. The figure slumped in a chair, its wax face eerie and lifelike, with deep eyes and a twisted, unsettling smile. The extraordinary detail made him shiver, wrinkles on the skin, hairs embedded perfectly in the wax. But there was something unsettling, a thin layer of moisture on the wax, making it seem as though it was sweating. Ryan placed the pizza box on the table, instinct urging him to leave. But something about the figure drew him closer. As he got closer, he noticed small cracks running along the wax skin. And then he saw it. Beneath one of the cracks was something red, a dark, congealed liquid. He didn't want to think it, but it might have been blood. Then, as he put his hand near the nose, he felt a faint breath. He leaned closer, and that's when he noticed the chest. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the chest was rising and falling ever so slightly. Ryan turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. Ryan spun around to see a man stepping out from the corner of the room, tall, gaunt. It was him, the man Ryan had met earlier. He wore a dark apron, stained with streaks of wax and blood. In his hand, he held a brush dripping with molten wax. Ryan held his breath as he realized what the man intended. Just as he thought, the figure in the chair wasn't a sculpture but a person, encased in wax, still alive. The man stepped closer, holding the brush like a weapon.
You shouldn't have come here, but maybe you'll make a fine addition.
Ryan dashed for the door, but the man was quicker, grabbing his arm. His grip was cold and sticky, and Ryan could feel the wax coating his skin.
Help me.
Ryan turned to see the wax man's lips moving, his eyes darting desperately. It was the first sign of life he had shown. Ryan broke free from the man's grip, grabbed the desk lamp, and smashed it into the man's face. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Ryan scrambled for the door, fumbling for the handle. Behind him, the man screamed in pain, and the buzzing in the air turned into a high-pitched shriek. Ryan bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. When he finally made it home, he scrubbed at his skin, desperate to remove the faint traces of wax clinging to his arms. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't shake the feeling it was still there. Ryan quit his job the next day and reported the incident to the police. He tried to forget what he had seen, but every night he was haunted by the image of the wax man's eyes. The guest at midnight. A few years ago, Jacob applied for a temporary job at a local gas station. He planned to move in 6 months, so he couldn't get a long-term job, but he still needed to make some cash beforehand. The job paid well enough to convince Jacob to take the night shift. All he had to do was man the register and occasionally handle routine maintenance. It was during his 4th month on the job. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one particular customer that stood out to Jacob. His name was Dave. He was a man in his early 40s who regularly stopped by the gas station around 1 or 2 a.m. every night. He would walk in and buy random things, sometimes household items, food, or tools. Occasionally, the things he purchased seemed oddly specific. One night, as usual, at 1 a.m., Dave entered the gas station. There were no other customers, just Jacob, sitting at the counter, waiting for him to walk in. Jacob immediately sensed something was off. Dave looked disheveled, sweating, and frantically searching for something. When he found it a master lock, the kind used for securing bikes, he rushed to the counter and tossed it down for checkout. Dave's strange behavior only made Jacob more curious.
Dave, did you get a new bike?
But Dave didn't even look at him, hastily pulling out cash instead. The night passed, and then several days did too. Jacob hadn't seen Dave in nearly a week, which was strange, considering Dave usually came in every night. It wasn't until Jacob's 4th shift that he saw Dave again. That night, a light drizzle fell outside. As usual, Dave stepped into the store. But this time, he rushed inside, muttering something inaudible. He looked agitated, and Jacob felt an unsettling sense of unease. His gut told him something was wrong. Then, a loud noise came from outside. The only thing there was Dave's car. The sound was sharp, like someone kicking the door from the inside. A second later, Jacob turned back to Dave. He was no longer in a rush. Instead, he stood in the aisle, staring directly at Jacob, like he had just realized something Jacob wasn't supposed to know. After that night, after seeing Dave's car and hearing that strange noise, Jacob knew he couldn't just sit still. He checked the gas station's security cameras, trying to figure out what Dave had been doing on his previous visits. Jacob recalled the items Dave had bought: rope, locks, duct tape. When put together, they all seemed to serve a sinister purpose. Determined not to let this go, Jacob decided to follow Dave. After tracking Dave's car several times, Jacob discovered that he frequently drove to a narrow forest road leading to an abandoned cabin near town. Choosing not to call the police just yet, Jacob drove there himself, bringing a flashlight and a folding knife for protection. As he neared the cabin, Jacob turned off his car's lights and stepped into the forest. Peering through a window, he saw Dave holding a knife, mumbling something to a woman tied to a chair. Jacob silently tried to find a way inside, but he accidentally kicked a log nearby, alerting Dave. He quickly ducked behind a pile of firewood, but Jacob didn't realize Dave had already spotted him. Before he knew it, Dave was right behind him, eyes wild, shouting,
"What the hell are you doing here?"
With no other choice, Jacob lunged at him, initiating a violent struggle. Dave swung his knife at Jacob, but he dodged and shoved him against the wall. The tied-up woman screamed, desperately trying to free herself. Distracted by her cries, Jacob was caught off guard as Dave landed a powerful punch, knocking him to the ground. As Dave charged forward to stab him, Jacob grabbed a nearby wooden plank and smashed it against Dave's head, making him stumble and drop the knife. But things weren't over yet. In the struggle, Dave tried to reach for the knife, but Jacob shoved him backward. He fell into an abandoned pit just outside the cabin. From above, Jacob watched as Dave lay motionless, his breaths growing weaker. Jacob freed the woman, and together they left, abandoning Dave to his fate in the darkness. His reckoning would come soon enough. The Curse of the Red Shirt Girl. Arthur was driving home from a friend's birthday party on a quiet night. The streets were empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the deserted roads. As he drove, he noticed a young girl standing alone by the roadside. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and wore a striking red coat over a white dress. To him, she looked beautiful, but as his car approached, she raised her hand, signaling for a ride. Arthur slowly pulled over and rolled down his window as she approached the car. The girl asked Arthur,
"Sir, if you don't mind, may I have a ride?"
He didn't think much of it and immediately agreed. She sat in the back seat. Feeling a little nervous, Arthur hesitantly asked her where she lived. She didn't say a word but handed him a small note. The address was written in faded ink, as if scribbled down years ago.
All right, what's your name?
Her lips barely moved as she whispered.
Mary Tailish.
A strange feeling crept over him. Something about her name seemed familiar, like a whisper from the past. Her expression never changed. He tried to ease the tension by asking about her interests. Her voice was flat.
I used to play with dolls when I was little, but I can't play with them anymore.
She smiled gently, but not in a normal way. It was unsettling, filled with sorrow.
They took them away from me.
Something about the way she spoke sent chills down Arthur's spine. They were nearing an old cemetery, its rusted iron gates glowing under the moonlight. Suddenly, Mary leaned forward. Mary asked him to stop at the cemetery gate. She placed her icy hand on his shoulder.
Please, take my coat and return it to my home as soon as possible.
For a brief moment, he swore her fingers didn't actually touch him. It was a strange, ghostly sensation. Before he could respond, she darted out of the car, heading toward the cemetery gates, leaving her red coat behind. The next day, Arthur arrived at the address. It was a large wooden house, located far in the quiet outskirts. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an elderly woman. He asked her about the woman he had met.
Ma'am, does Mary Tailish live here?
But then something unexpected happened. The woman suddenly burst into tears and invited him inside. The house was large and beautifully decorated inside. He noticed pictures of Mary. In every single one, she was wearing the same red coat. The woman began telling him about Mary. She was their daughter. One night, while she was on her way home, a group of men kidnapped her and took her away. The mother had been worried sick. 2 days later, the police found Mary's body. Her eyes and left arm were missing. Arthur was speechless. He had seen her eyes, her hands, her beating heart when she sat in his car. But in reality, Mary Tailish had been dead for years. Trying to remain calm, he handed them her coat, then left. As soon as he got into his car, he saw Mary again. But this time, she wasn't the same. She was no longer human. Her red coat still clung to her shoulders, but now it was tattered and soaked in something dark. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen, and she gave him a chilling smile before vanishing. Arthur tried to push it all out of his mind, but for days, he kept seeing Mary in every shadow, every reflection in the window. One night, he woke up in bed and saw her standing in the corner of his room. Her left hand was missing, a dark stain on her chest where something had been taken. She whispered,
Arthur, you helped me.
Her freezing fingers touched his forehead. Suddenly, sharp pain, screams, and the sound of something being cut open filled his mind. He saw dark figures, their shadows stretching over a struggling girl. He felt her terror. Then he saw their faces, their eyes, staring directly at him. Then darkness. Arthur woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and decided to go to the police station. He thought they'd laugh at him, but instead, they pulled out old case files. It was all real, but they had never found the suspects. The news became a major headline. Arthur had, in some way, helped bring justice for Mary Tailish. There was a legend Arthur later found online. Anyone who meets Mary Tailish must help her, or they will meet a terrible fate. Luckily, Arthur had been kind to her. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George.
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient. And I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me.
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira,
Help you? Tell me how.
Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment. The experiment killed me.
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, It was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light, her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave, and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispery, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
She said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, Jan? I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me. her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty, like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. Horror Story Red Bracelet. I have worked at the hospital for 10 years, something I am very proud of. Most people I meet here have an average working time of just 1 year. The shortest time someone stayed was 1 week. Working here is not easy. They say staff are cursed if they do something wrong. Lights fall on people's heads, they slip on completely dry floors, and fires frequently break out. Patients sometimes become inexplicably violent. No matter how many times they inspect the building or add security staff, the employees always seem to be targeted by bad luck. Even after many years here, I don't know why, but I don't believe in that. I just try to do my best at work. Since working here, nothing unfortunate has ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear strange noises, but they are insignificant. I've gotten used to it and become resilient. One night after a late shift, I stepped into the elevator and immediately pressed the close button to slowly descend to the lobby from the 11th floor, alone. When it reached the 9th floor, the door opened. Reflexively, I reached out to press the close button but stopped when I saw someone standing there. It was a beautiful young girl I had never seen before, probably a new intern. Something about her made me want to talk and ask about her work. I placed my arm in the door to let her in. I asked if she was new. She shyly nodded without saying anything. I was very happy to get to know her. I saw her name tag. Her name was Ilsa. Every night after that, after my shift, at the same time on the 9th floor, Ilsa would be standing there waiting. This surprised me, but I thought it was just a coincidence. She didn't say anything, just bowed her head shy. For the first time in a long while, I decided to open up and make a new friend. One night, while going down in the elevator, as expected, the door opened on the 9th floor where Ilsa was waiting to get in. I decided to ask if she would like to have a drink with me. As soon as she stepped in, she heard a loud noise at the end of the hallway. Both of us looked out. From the corner of the hallway, a dark figure of a man appeared. He was tall, limping, and heading straight for the elevator.
Wait!
The man called out, "And now." She immediately reached out her hand to hold the door. The man sped up and shouted, "Help me! Help!" As the man got closer, my stomach began to churn. Wait, something wasn't right with me. The man was now just a few steps away from the elevator. He waved at us, revealing a red wristband that was bleeding. I immediately pulled Ilsa back and closed the elevator door. He pounded on the door continuously. I recalled the cold, clinical atmosphere of the morgue. The bodies lay on metal slabs, each with a red wristband. The image of a young girl's lifeless hand, limp from the weight of the wristband, flashed through his mind. His heart pounded, a mix of confusion and fear. The elevator swayed, bringing Jazz back to the present. He looked at Ilsa again. She slowly and coldly said,
Why did you do that? Why didn't you help him?
I replied,
I couldn't help him. He was wearing a red wristband, which is only for the deceased in the morgue.
She didn't speak. Then suddenly, she pressed the button to go down to the warehouse basement. Even I rarely go down there alone. I followed Ilsa down a narrow, dark corridor he hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with old, faded photos of patients and staff, all wearing red wristbands. The air grew colder. Then her hand fell down, revealing a red wristband. Her back was covered in numerous torn shirt marks. I froze, wondering what this was. Dizzy, dreaming perhaps. I started screaming loudly, and she gave me a horrifying smile. At that moment, all I could do was run for my life, and she kept slowly following me. When I reached the elevator door, I pressed the button frantically, uncontrollably. But the elevator didn't open. My breathing was so rapid I couldn't control it. I just stood there, eyes closed, praying. I held my breath because she was only a few meters behind me, walking slowly. Without waiting any longer, I had to find the emergency exit to run up to the first floor. I ran like I had never run before. Thank God I escaped that dreadful, terrifying place. I might have stayed there too long. It was probably time to leave. The next day, I quit my job. Years later, after I left, I learned that it had been officially abandoned without any explanation. It was a horrifying and unforgettable experience for me. Stalker at the bus stop. A quiet and snowy Sunday evening. I was sitting at the bus stop, looking at my phone, and realized I had missed my bus. I started to shiver as the weather grew colder. Time passed slowly. I pulled out my phone again, put on my earphones, and selected a song to forget the uncomfortable cold. I looked around, realizing I was completely alone. No cars, no pedestrians, just an endless, empty street. Nearly an hour went by, and the bus was still nowhere in sight. I checked my phone again. The screen showed no updates on the bus's arrival, and the battery was dangerously low. A while later, I sensed some movement. A man wrapped in several layers of thick clothing, his face obscured by a knitted hood. The man walked with a strange, almost unsteady gait, as if he wasn't sure where he was going. I froze but tried to focus on my phone, not wanting to draw attention. The man approached the bus stop and sat at the opposite end of the bench. My discomfort grew. I glanced at the man, noticing part of his face exposed under the hood, a gaunt, pale face with eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. The man was muttering something to himself, his words slurred and incoherent. I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was off about this person. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly at first, but with each subtle shift, he inched toward me. My unease turned into panic as the man continued to slide closer, his gaze fixed on me in a strange, unsettling way. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I felt the man's presence right next to me. The tension was unbearable. I quickly stood up, grabbed my bag, and started walking away from the bus stop. The man, still sitting there, tilted his head to the side, his eyes never leaving me as I walked away. I quickly walked away. I reached the next bus stop and finally felt somewhat relieved. I began to sit down slowly, letting my guard down a little as I waited for the bus. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhausted. The quiet of the falling snow was almost peaceful. Suddenly, a loud and rapid knock shattered the silence. My eyes shot open, my heart racing, and I slowly turned around to see the man from the previous bus stop, standing on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it, grinning maniacally. His eyes were wide, staring straight at me without blinking. He kept knocking on the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. Panic flooded my body. I quickly stood up and backed away from the glass. The man began moving, circling around, his gait more erratic than before. His footsteps grew closer. I backed away, yelling at the man to stay away. However, the man was undeterred. He raised his hand, reaching out as if to do something to me. Luckily, I reacted just in time, darting off the sidewalk as the man lunged toward me. In a a strange, inexplicable way, he slipped forward, his face slamming hard into the cold, icy pavement. The sound was horrifying. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so bizarre. I watched in horror as blood began to pool around the man's face, staining the snow with a deep red. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just occurred. I crouched down, attempting to get a response from him, but there was none. I sat down on the curb, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called for help. The snow continued to fall, turning this bus stop into a place of horror and dread for me. The flashing lights of the ambulance and police car pierced through the night. Paramedics rushed to the man's side, but it was clear that something was very wrong with him. As the paramedics searched the man's belongings, they found a photograph in his wallet, a picture of the man with a boy who looked eerily similar to me. The police explained that the man had been on prescription drugs after losing his son, and his mental state had deteriorated ever since. I realized, with disbelief, that the man may have mistaken me for his lost son. A few days later, I took my driving test. As I drove, I glanced down the road where the bus stop was in the distance, the events of that night still haunting me deeply. I couldn't shake the sorrow of the man's grief and the terrifying experience that had unfolded. The Stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
"Someone like her with someone like you?"
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, The man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. The Yin and Yang Train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison. the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. The Haunting of Route 23. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, driving on long, desolate highways at all hours. As a truck driver, I've gotten used to isolation, to the silence of the road. As a truck driver, I've also had to get used to sometimes sleeping in dangerous places. I was driving along Route 23, a road known for its long, deserted stretches. It's a 30-mile stretch of highway surrounded by endless rows of trees and dark tunnels. I had been driving for 3 hours, and I usually stop for a break after 4. I didn't particularly like this road, but I had no other choice. I spotted a small parking lot up ahead, a flat patch of land nestled between the trees. It was just big enough for my truck. I turned in and parked there. The dense trees surrounded me with a sense of desolation and silence. I stepped outside to brush my teeth. While brushing, I heard the sound of an engine echoing in the distance. A car was approaching, but instead of passing by, it slowly crept closer. Its windows were dark, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I hurried back to the safety of my truck, slamming the door shut. I wrapped the seatbelt around the handle, an old trucker's trick, to make it harder for anyone to open the door from the outside. I had done this many times before in dangerous places, but tonight, it felt necessary. I pulled the curtain shut and lay down on the bed in the back of the truck, covering myself with the blanket. But the fatigue from the long drive soon took over, and within minutes, I was fast asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when a noise woke me up. It was footsteps, soft and slow, circling the truck. Then they stopped right outside the driver's door. Then came a loud, violent knock on the door. I jolted up, almost falling out of bed. The knocking on the door grew more frantic, more aggressive. My hands fumbled as I tried to shove my shoes on. I shouted, "Who's out there?" But there was no answer, just the banging getting louder. I rushed to the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. The truck roared to life. I pulled the curtain aside, ready to drive off. And that's when I saw him. A man, dressed all in black, stood just inches from the truck. He held a large knife in one hand and a hammer in the other. We locked eyes, and he twisted his face into a grotesque, maniacal grin. He seemed unhinged. Then he lifted the knife in front of me, as if taunting and provoking me. My truck suddenly stalled. I hit the horn, warning him I would charge if he didn't back off. But instead of retreating, the man started walking toward me. He quickened his pace. Then he started sprinting toward me, yelling as he ran. The knife and hammer swung wildly in his hands as he charged at the truck. I realized my window was still cracked open. I reached to close it, but before I could, his face was pressed against the glass. His wild eyes stared into mine. He grinned, nodding toward the window. With a sudden swing, The hammer smashed against the driver's side window. The glass shook but held. My hands trembled as I tried to restart the engine. Another swing. This time, the glass shattered. A third swing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the window. It was about to give completely. My life hung by a thread. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas just as the window opened. The man screamed as the truck lunged forward, throwing him off balance. His hammer was still lodged in the broken window as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stand up. He stood in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. His silhouette was clearly visible in the mirror. I haven't driven like that since. That night taught me to always be prepared, to plan my route down to the smallest detail. Now, I sleep in safer places, far from empty parking lots. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, Her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. The Madman at the Cinema. On a cold evening, Beth stood in the staff room, scrolling through her phone as the night shift neared its end. It was a late shift, one of those nights that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a small, slightly run-down cinema with just one screen. Snow was falling heavier outside, and she was eager to get home after a long night of cleaning. As she texted her mother to let her know she was okay, the door creaked open, and her manager, Mr. Miller, walked in. Mr. Miller spoke in his usual tone.
Don't forget to lock the back door after you're done. I'll have William pick up the keys for tomorrow's shift. Also, check if the toilet's leaking before you leave.
Beth sighed, not thrilled about the last-minute request. She nodded and bid her manager goodbye before he left her to finish her tasks. Beth worked as part of the cleaning crew, but the cinema felt eerily empty after the final screening ended. As Beth walked down the rows of seats, sweeping up popcorn and other debris, a chill ran down her spine. Something about the atmosphere tonight felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Beth's phone buzzed, and she picked it up. It was her mom, worried about her working the night shift again, and saying it wasn't safe. Beth began reassuring her. Beth hung up. With a sigh, she turned on some music on her phone and placed it on one of the red seats in the theater as she continued cleaning. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint sound, almost like glass shattering. It came from the emergency exit. Beth called out,
"Who's there?"
But no one answered. She stopped the music and started toward the emergency exit, which opened to reveal a long hallway with flickering lights.
"Is anyone out there? Hello?"
She continued walking, then froze in front of a shattered window. Glass lay scattered on the floor, along with a large rock that someone had likely thrown from outside. She wasn't alone. Beth instinctively reached into her pocket for her phone, but then she remembered it was still on the seat in the theater. She hesitated. Should she go back for it? But things were becoming more complicated. Without wasting another second, Beth hurried back to the theater. As she rounded the corner, Beth froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was a shadowy figure. He had his back to her, swaying unnaturally, like someone who had lost control. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair was a mess. Beth tried to quietly sneak away, but then he turned around, her stomach sinking as she froze in place. The light illuminated his horrifying face. He wore a sinister grin, like a grotesque mask, a mix of burns and hollow, bloodshot, crazed eyes. As she faced him, he revealed his dark intentions, saying,
"I've been waiting for you. I will have you."
Beth stumbled back toward the theater as the man began chasing her, laughing and running like a madman. When she reached the seat where her phone lay, she grabbed it and ran deeper into the theater, hiding behind the rows of seats. Her hand reached for a mop nearby, ready to defend herself. Beth tried to call the police, but before she could speak, the emergency exit door burst open, and the man lunged in with a chilling, raspy laugh. She dared not breathe or move, but then she felt breathing above her head, freezing her in place. He suddenly appeared behind the seat, laughing in amusement.
"You can't hide forever, Beth. I can hear your little heart racing."
Terrified, Beth ran, instinctively grabbing anything she could and hurling it at him to slow him down, throwing him off balance. Beth quietly crawled under the seats, making her way toward the exit. She was almost there and bolted for the door, but he noticed her movement at the last second and lunged at her. His icy hand grabbed Beth's hair. He yanked her back violently, causing her immense pain. Beth screamed, kicking with all her strength. Desperation surged within her as she grabbed a sharp piece of debris. She stabbed his hand, leaving a deep gash. He howled in pain, letting her go just long enough for Beth to get up and run toward the exit. She slammed the door shut, locking it and blocking it with a stick. Despite his screams and pounding,
"I'll be back. I'll find you."
She ran outside, barely noticing the cold, trembling as she called for help. Later, the police revealed that the man had been stalking Beth for weeks. even poisoning her cat to cause her grief. Beth was horrified. She had never known the man, but he had inserted himself into her life without her knowledge for a long time. Beth survived, but her life was forever changed. She was in shock, undergoing therapy, and eventually moved in with her sister. The madness of the masked man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it, but as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, a shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips, as if daring her to approach.
Come outside, Susan.
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan, I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
"Jeff?"
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
"What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?"
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily, As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. Seeking the truth. The city never sleeps, and Kevin does his best to make a living as a night shift taxi driver. He is a hard-working and kind man. One foggy night, as Kevin followed his usual route, he turned a corner onto a quiet, nearly deserted street and saw her. A woman stood alone under the flickering glow of a street lamp. She was dressed in black, her long hair hanging loose, and her pale hand raised to hail his taxi. Something about her seemed off, but Kevin's job wasn't to ask questions, it was to drive. The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, handing him a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled address. The address was unfamiliar to him and seemed unsettling. As they drove through increasingly deserted streets, Kevin tried to make conversation, but she remained coldly silent. When they finally arrived, a decaying, abandoned house on the edge of a forest loomed in the darkness. Kevin stopped the car, unease building as he turned to tell her they had arrived and mentioned the fare. Then Kevin turned around to find the back seat empty. The door was shut, and the woman was gone, as though she had never been there. No money, no sound, no trace. Confusion mixed with a hint of anger as he stared into the darkness. He chalked it up to a strange, unlucky night and drove away, determined to forget it. A few days later, Kevin was driving through the city again. Once more, he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She looked eerily familiar. The dress, the posture, the loose hair. Was it the same woman? Kevin wasn't sure. He hadn't paid close attention to her face last time. But this time, she seemed different. She was clutching her stomach as if injured or ill. Her face was pale and strained, as though in great pain. She looked like she was struggling to stay upright. Kevin hesitated, memories of the previous encounter surfacing, but he couldn't ignore her distress and slowly pulled over. He parked by the curb and rolled down the window.
Are you okay?
She didn't answer, her lips trembling, but after a moment, she slowly looked up. The woman's gaze met his briefly, her wide, haunting eyes struggling to utter a single whispered word.
Help!
Kevin wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. He told her to get in and said he would take her where she needed to go. She quietly got into the car, her breathing shallow and labored, but she said nothing more. Her presence was icy. She handed him a piece of paper. It was an address near the edge of the forest, close to the previous location. An eerie coincidence. This time, the destination was a hospital instead of an old house. The ride was bizarre. Occasionally, he glanced at her, her hand pressed tightly against her stomach, but she remained utterly still. Her breathing was nearly inaudible, like the distant whisper of the wind, hollow and empty. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped the car, but a cold breeze brushed his ear, sending chills down his spine.
Help me.
A cold draft swept into the car, making him shiver. When Kevin turned around, the woman was gone. The rear door was wide open, and the seat she had occupied was empty.
What the hell is happening?
The woman's sudden disappearance left him frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His hands trembled as he locked the doors, quickly started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Back at home, Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. Questions gnawed at him. Who was that woman? How did she disappear? And why did she lead him there? Something strange was going on. After days of pondering, Kevin couldn't shake the fear tormenting him. He returned to the hospital, hoping to find answers. He asked the staff about the woman he had seen, but no one seemed to know anything about her. But after all that, he found no leads. In his moment of despair, he suddenly saw the shadow of the woman he had seen before. She was standing at the end of the hospital corridor, and the place felt eerily empty, save for the two of them. Unable to explain why, he followed her to a locker belonging to a man. The name on the locker read Dr. Don. He had no idea what this meant. Was there a connection between her and this man? Moments later, Kevin was still standing in the hallway, but she was gone. Instead, the usual sounds of hospital staff working, patients moving, and the general hum of life returned. Everything seemed normal again. As Kevin contemplated leaving, unsure of who this Dr. Don was, a nurse's voice called out from behind him, "Dr. Don." He froze and turned to see a tall, slender doctor with a beard and glasses that gave him an air of intellect. Kevin noticed that the people around seemed to hold him in high regard. Kevin questioned himself. Was there anything suspicious about a man like that? He certainly didn't seem the type. Still, Kevin decided to sit and observe. Dr. Don stepped out of his office and headed toward the exit. Kevin quietly followed until the doctor turned around to look at him. The doctor didn't appear worried at all and spoke in a calm, composed voice.
Hello, can I help you with something?
Kevin, feeling flustered, lied and said he was visiting his girlfriend here. Kevin deflected by glancing at his name tag.
Dr. Don, this is my first time seeing you. You seem well liked.
The doctor smiled politely and excused himself, but Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kevin returned to the corridor, beginning to feel ridiculous and questioning if he was taking things too far. Then, the woman appeared again at the end of the hallway. A whisper close to his ear said,
"Help me, please."
Kevin froze, but the encounter reinforced his resolve. Maybe it was time to follow his instincts. Dr. Don's silhouette was retreating. Kevin decided to follow him cautiously, and, strangely, Dr. Don was heading toward the very house the woman had led him to before. The old, decaying, and completely isolated house. The windows of the house were nearly boarded up. After a while, Dr. Don left the house through the front door, locking it behind him. Kevin pressed himself against a pile of wood nearby to avoid being seen. Once Dr. Don was out of sight, Kevin crept to the back of the house and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Opening it cautiously, Kevin stepped inside. Inside was a mess of decay and foul odors. Rubber gloves, small glass jars, and scraps of fabric were scattered across the floor, along with dark, dried stains. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he heard sounds coming from a room not far away. The door was shut tight and locked. Breaking it open would cause a loud noise and be extremely risky. Suddenly, she appeared again, standing next to a cabinet. Her eyes locked onto Kevin before shifting toward the cabinet. It revealed a key hidden behind the shelf. In an instant, she vanished once more, perhaps guiding Kevin. Just as Kevin reached for the key, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he hid in a small cabinet, barely fitting inside before Dr. Don returned. Through the crack of the cabinet door, Kevin saw him open the room and drag out a heavy bag. The doctor retrieved a syringe and a small glass vial, proceeding to do something suspicious. A creak inadvertently escaped from the cabinet where Kevin was hiding. Dr. Don put his tools down and approached the cabinet. Kevin held his breath, preparing for the worst. As Dr. Don got closer, Kevin realized he had no escape. Seizing the moment, he burst out, pushing the doctor to the ground before dashing into the forest behind the house. Dr. Don chased after Kevin. At the edge of the forest, Kevin managed to call the police. As they ran deeper into the woods, Kevin's years of experience in the wilderness began to pay off. His eyes caught a marked tree stump. He remembered traps he had learned about as a child, the kind hunters used for animals. It was a net trap leading to a concealed pit. Kevin stopped, carefully observing and calculating. Dr. Don approached with a scalpel in hand.
You know too much. This will be quick, he sneered.
As he neared the trap, Kevin deliberately moved slowly, calmly observing. Suddenly, Kevin jumped aside. Doctor. Don lunged forward, oblivious to the trap. Bam! A loud snap echoed as he fell into the concealed pit, screaming in pain. Shortly after, the police arrived and uncovered the horrifying events that had taken place in the house. Doctor. Don's past was plagued by an abusive father. He had built a facade of respectability, but was, in reality, a monster. He would overdose his patients with drugs and record their suffering while laughing maniacally. Many had met unjust ends at the hands of this madman. The woman Kevin had seen was found deceased at the scene. She had sought help, likely for her sister, who had also been held captive in the same house. They had both uncovered Dr. Don's depravity. Kevin was haunted by everything he had experienced. He wondered how many others like her had wandered into the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to help before it was too late. In the end, though, Dr. Don finally faced justice. The sinister plan of the imposter. Leo, a 13-year-old boy, was sent to stay with his Uncle Donnie in a remote, isolated town for a few weeks, while his mother resolved some personal matters. He never imagined this visit would turn into a nightmare. When Leo first arrived, Uncle Danny was a warm and friendly man, welcoming him with open arms. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The house was old but cozy. However, as time passed, Leo began noticing strange things. Uncle Danny's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at the walls, mumbling to himself, and engaging in peculiar habits. One evening, Leo spotted his uncle in the yard with a net and a glass jar, seemingly catching something peculiar. Then, Uncle Danny brought it to the backyard balcony. What Leo saw next left him frozen in disbelief. Leo saw his uncle holding a larva. To his horror, Uncle Danny calmly placed it into his mouth, swallowing it without any sign of disgust. Leo tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just an eccentricity, but the strangeness grew. Uncle Danny's cooking became odd. Once delicious meals now looked disturbing, sometimes containing unrecognizable ingredients. One night, Leo started suspecting something far worse was happening. He called his mother, explaining what he had witnessed, but she didn't believe him at first. He needed evidence. Leo's unease grew as Uncle Danny became increasingly distant and frightening. At night, Leo began hearing strange noises coming from his uncle's room. Uncle Danny even avoided eye contact, something he never did before. His smiles became forced and unsettling. One afternoon, Leo snuck into the kitchen to take pictures and videos of his uncle, preparing another strange meal. The photo shocked him. From this angle, his uncle looked unrecognizable, his features distorted. Terrified, Leo sent the photo to his mother. Her initial skepticism turned into horror. She called him back. "Leo, you need to stay calm. Just wait there. I'll come get you," she reassured him, though Leo could hear the anxiety in her voice. As time passed, Leo began to feel an overwhelming pressure. He couldn't just wait. He had to do something before it was too late. He remembered his mother mentioning Uncle Danny's insomnia. Recalling the bottle of sleeping pills in the bathroom, Leo quietly took it and slipped it into his pocket as he tiptoed into the kitchen. Uncle Danny was there, his back turned to Leo as he prepared something with a foul, frightening smell. Leo quickly crushed the pills and mixed them into the food. That night, Uncle Danny ate the food without suspicion, but he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Leo sat in his room, waiting. The storm outside raged on, and the world beyond seemed to be closing in on him. His mother called again, telling him that a light snowstorm was sweeping through the area, but she would try to get there as soon as possible. Time was running out. Hours passed. Leo couldn't take it anymore. He had to ensure his mother would arrive. He went downstairs, and that's when he saw him again. Uncle Donnie approached Leo in a frightening manner, but Leo smiled, acting as though nothing was wrong. Leo told him his mother was coming to visit, and that she said she was very hungry. He asked if Uncle Danny could help him prepare a meal for her. Leo breathed a sigh of relief when his uncle froze for a moment before smiling and agreeing. It felt like a narrow escape. Leo needed to come up with more ways to stall for time until his mother arrived. The upcoming moments would be a living nightmare. After a while, Uncle Danny went to the back of the house, while the snow outside continued to fall heavily. The ticking of the old clock seemed louder in the silence. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a man standing on the doorstep, his face pale and cold. He introduced himself as being from the town hospital, saying that Uncle Danny hadn't shown up for his volunteer shifts in days and hadn't been heard from. Leo didn't know how to respond, unsure if his suspicions were correct, so he simply said Uncle Danny was out. The man left, but Leo's unease continued to grow. Later, while Uncle Danny was away, Leo didn't know what to do, so he began exploring the house and discovered secrets in the basement. When he opened the basement door, the room was cluttered with old boxes and furniture. He found jars filled with strange, wriggling creatures, along with the rancid stench of rotting food. Among the mess, Leo found an old photo of two people, a woman and a man. The man looked strikingly like Uncle Danny, only older and slightly different. The snowstorm worsened. The lights flickered, and eventually, the house was plunged into darkness. Leo used the dim glow of his phone flashlight and slowly crept up the stairs. He wandered toward the living room aimlessly. Then suddenly, a creaking sound came from somewhere in the house. In the living room, through the faint light streaming in from outside, Leo saw a figure sitting on a chair, facing the wall. It was a familiar silhouette. The silence in the room was stifling. Without warning, Uncle Danny suddenly turned around, his wild, vacant eyes glaring at Leo. "You think I didn't know, Leo?" Leo froze, fear washing over him. His heart pounded as if it wanted to escape his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his hands began trembling. Donnie took a step closer, leaning in, his voice low and tense. "You ate the cake in my fridge, didn't you?" Leo froze, his eyes wide, muttering a vague apology and offering an excuse to deflect suspicion. In truth, he didn't even know the cake existed. Moments later, the lights came back on, and Leo tried to think of a way to stall until his mother arrived. In his anxiety, he recalled Uncle Danny once mentioning a small cellar under the kitchen where he kept special items. He asked his uncle to retrieve an item for him, claiming he was afraid of the dark and confined spaces. Donnie paused, staring at Leo with a puzzled expression. "All right, Leo," he said, his voice slow, as though contemplating something. Then he uttered a chilling sentence. "One last time, I'll indulge you." Danny bent down, yanking the cellar door open. The hinges screeched loudly in the eerie silence, as he squinted into the darkness below. The cellar was pitch black, and a musty odor wafted out, forcing Leo to step back to steady himself. As Danny was halfway into the cellar, Leo suddenly heard him let out a cold, menacing chuckle. Then he stopped, looked up at Leo and said, "You know, Leo, there's so much more to discover down here. Would you like to come in?" Leo shuddered, fear rising in his throat. But he managed to keep his composure and immediately declined. Donnie laughed loudly, then continued descending into the cellar. Once he was completely out of sight, Leo realized he had only one chance. But at that moment, Donnie suddenly looked up, his eyes gleaming like a predator spotting prey, shouting to ask what Leo was doing. Leo didn't answer, quickly stepping forward, grabbing the cellar door and slamming it shut with all his strength. Donnie roared from below, his screams a mix of rage and panic. He hurriedly slid the latch to lock the cellar door. From below, Donnie's pounding on the door echoed fiercely. When the police and his mother arrived, Donnie was pulled out of the cellar in a completely unhinged state. He screamed and repeated nonsensical words about the darkness. Leo's mother couldn't believe her eyes, as they had initially believed this man was Uncle Danny. But now, the truth was undeniable. He was a psychiatric patient. During one of Uncle Danny's volunteer shifts at the hospital, where the man was being treated, he had met Danny and felt a strange connection. He became increasingly obsessed with Uncle Danny's life. When Danny mentioned Leo's upcoming visit, he decided it would be fun to experience that life, taking Danny's place. His mother held him tightly after everything they had just learned. It was over, but the pain of the loss and the truth about his late uncle would haunt Leo in sleepless nights to come. The ride on the strange road. I live a straightforward life, and I'm certain that what I saw and heard on New Year's Eve last year wasn't a hallucination or anything like that. It was 100% real. A friend of mine, Darren, had his family host a New Year's Eve party at their house, where all the family's friends were invited. It was in one of those affluent neighborhoods and could only be accessed via rural roads. There were no other houses along the turn, except for a hastily built, solitary house that seemed abandoned for years, occasionally with flickering lights visible. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something ahead among the trees. As I got closer, I could see it was the figure of a person standing alone by the roadside. A woman, clearly dressed in a white dress, was standing completely still, looking out of place in the cold winter weather. Although I briefly considered stopping to help, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw her slowly turn around, seemingly following me with a cold, eerie gaze. When I arrived at Darren's house, I pushed the unsettling experience out of my mind and enjoyed the party. After ringing in the new year, I stayed a bit longer to help clean up, as I was one of Darren's close family friends. As I left and started my car, I noticed the low tire pressure light was on. My car was an older model, so it didn't specify which tire. I remembered this often happened when the weather turned cold, so I didn't think much of it. I could take an alternate route home to avoid the road where I saw the woman, but it would add about 20 minutes. I decided to tough it out and take the old route. I truly wish I hadn't, even for just a few seconds. Something was off with the tires. I could hear it too, a sound like metal scraping against the road. Foolishly, I got out of the car. The headlights automatically turned off, plunging me into the deep darkness of the surrounding forest. Using my phone flashlight, I inspected each tire and found one mysteriously torn to shreds. Stranded in an area with no cell signal, everything grew eerily silent. Suddenly, I heard the chilling voice of a woman saying,
"I see you."
Then I aimed my flashlight straight ahead again. Standing at the edge of the trees was the woman in the white dress. This time, her features were clear. Her dress was stained with mud, her frame was gaunt and pale, and her tangled hair hung down to her elbows. I sprinted toward Darren's house, hearing the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves behind me. She was chasing me, but I managed to lose her quickly. I finally made it to Darren's house. I banged on the door, pleading for them to open it. I explained what had happened. They offered to let me stay overnight while they called the police and arranged for a tow truck. But I soon realized it wasn't over. I woke up to the sound of knocking at 3 a.m. Of course, none of the windows in the room had curtains. I didn't dare look outside until I heard a deep, raspy voice. I sat frozen on the bed, listening to the sound of stones hitting the window. The voice of that woman echoed from the darkness.
I see you.
Admittedly, I might be a coward, but at that moment, all I could do was hide under the blanket and avoid looking outside. I stayed silent until morning. The next morning, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife that didn't belong to the family, likely the one the woman had used to slash my tires. But this also meant she had followed my car to the party. After they called the police, I gave my statement. I suggested they check the cabin along the road because I had a feeling that the woman was connected to it. Eventually, they investigated and updated me, saying they didn't find anyone living there, but there were many dried animal carcasses scattered throughout the surrounding forest. The woman I saw was never found, which of course raises many questions. But the most terrifying thing to me is how she was able to track me so quickly. I started this year's journey determined not to let fear dictate my actions. The events of last New Year's Eve haunted me every day, but I was tired of running from the darkness. I convinced myself that she was merely a ghost, and the other events were just eerily perfect coincidences. But this time, I decided to take a detour, a different route to Darren's party, and it was much farther than the one I had taken before. Something felt off. The GPS signal cut out midway, and the road I was on seemed unfamiliar. I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I followed the path I remembered most vividly. And then, as if by fate, the winding road curved, and I found myself facing it. That house by the roadside, it still bore the taped-off markings from when the police had been there. I parked the car, engine still running, and sat for a moment, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine, but I slowly stepped out of the car. Gathering all my courage, I stepped onto the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. I knocked once. Nothing. Then I slowly pushed the door open. The wooden house looked even more dilapidated, with parts of the roof sagging, rotting beams, rickety furniture, a few broken chairs, and a fireplace stuffed with what looked like bones. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it, almost like a whisper, unmistakable.
Come closer.
It sent shivers down my spine. Then, I turned on my phone's flashlight. Another horrifying sight revealed itself before me. I saw the walls. They were covered in crude drawings, scratched into the surface, as if by something sharp, along with claw marks that looked agonizing. Names were scrawled beneath each face. The horrifying part was seeing one that matched my own. When the light stopped at a wooden table in the middle of the room, I saw a sharp knife, a few jars filled with dark red liquid, and even animal teeth. I started to wonder, could someone have moved in here? Could it belong to a hunter? I didn't think these things had been here for long, as the police had said the house was completely empty when they searched it.
You're braver than I thought.
A voice emerged from the darkness. I spun around. She stood at the far end of the room, tall, pale, and gaunt. Her white dress was smeared with mud and streaks of red, her deranged eyes staring right at me. She lunged at me with terrifying speed. In her hand, she held a knife, and it was aimed straight at me. I instinctively grabbed the knife on the table nearby to defend myself. I swung it, but she dodged and shoved me to the ground. We struggled, our heavy breaths and screams echoing in the cramped space. She laughed maniacally, her nails clawing into my skin. Everything happened so fast, filled with panic. I fought back, using all my strength to shove her off. I reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground, grabbed it, and stabbed her in the shoulder. Her scream pierced the air. She screamed, but didn't stop. Her eyes burned with madness.
You won't escape, Drake.
Charging at me again. I grabbed a jar from the same table and smashed it over her head. This time, she staggered, visibly dazed, and slowly collapsed. Without hesitation, I ran out of there and barricaded the door with a wooden plank nearby, hoping it would hold her off for a while. I got into my car and immediately called the police. I didn't stop until I reached Darren's house, trembling and covered in blood. The police arrived shortly after my call. They didn't find her in the house, but this time she couldn't escape. The trail of blood from her wounds led into the forest. In their report, they said she was a deranged individual who had been stalking people traveling this deserted route, including me. She had set up horrifying traps to play with me. It turned out that all along, I had mistaken her for a ghost conjured by my paranoia or something far more sinister that I couldn't comprehend. The clown in the tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still, He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nye found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
"Who's there?"
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
"I've waited a long time."
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
"There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both."
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nee heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
"Help me. Free me from the curse."
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. "You have only one chance." Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. "Understand the final rhythm before you play."
"Please, help me. Save me."
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Nee realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Nee studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever." Nee swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Nee sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Nee's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Nee realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
"Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place,"
he cried out, his voice laced with agony. Nee played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, The piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Nee found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Nee collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Nee didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying, tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, And for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. Thank you. I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, but he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. Hide and seek in an abandoned house. Today, I decided to ignore my parents' warnings and meet up with my friends to play hide and seek in the old abandoned house near the woods. I remember everything clearly: the musty air, the creaking floors, and the thrill that washed over me as we sneaked into the dilapidated building. Jack, Rian, Lexi, and I. We loved adventure and the adrenaline rush, but nothing could compare to the mystery of that house. The house was surrounded by barbed wire, with the gate tightly locked, but we found a small hole in the wall, hidden behind overgrown grass, just big enough for us to crawl through one by one. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We decided to play hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I closed my eyes and started counting. The others scattered throughout the house, laughing, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms.
98, 99, 100.
I opened my eyes and immediately went searching for my friends. It didn't take long to find Lexi and Rian, but Jack was different. He was always better at hiding. I searched every nook and cranny, every room, until I caught a glimpse of a shadow darting by.
Got you, Jack.
I mumbled and ran after him. But something was strange. The shadow seemed faster, slipping around corners as if leading me on. My excitement turned into doubt and fear. No matter how close I thought I was, the shadow always evaded me, disappearing just as I was about to catch up. Not long after, Jack finally came out of the master bedroom, scratching his head. He apologized, saying he had hidden in the closet and fallen asleep. But my heart skipped a beat. Who had I been chasing? I gasped and told Jack and the others what had happened. They laughed, teasing me for trying to scare them. Determined to prove it, I convinced them to play again. We played again. I resumed searching, but soon that uneasy feeling returned. The house was too quiet, too still. My friends were nowhere to be found, and the more I searched, the more convinced I became that something terrible had happened. Then I saw it again. A hand reached out from behind a wall, waving at me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of shoes on the ground, just like Lexi's. I called out, but she didn't answer. The hand waved at me again from afar. I moved closer, but as I approached, the hand disappeared. I chased after it, only to find another arm waving from the top of the stairs. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find anyone. Then I saw a face that looked like Rian's in the window. He stood still, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, I knew something was wrong. I pressed my face against the window to get a closer look, and it was a child, about our age, but with a wrinkled, aged face, eerie and twisted. His clothes were stained with red patches, and I froze when I saw him holding something, a long, rusted, sharp metal rod. Before I could move, he spoke in a chilling voice.
"Oh, you found me. Now it's my turn."
He grinned widely, then began counting.
1, 2, 3.
Panic surged through me. I didn't take the steps one by one. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could. His laughter echoed behind me. I remembered the secret closet Jack had hidden in earlier. In desperation, I dove inside, pulling the door shut and holding my breath as I listened. I didn't dare make a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would leave. I must have passed out from lack of oxygen. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. It turned out my parents and the police had been searching for us all night, and my friends had managed to escape to alert them. Later, we found out that he was the escaped mental patient the police had been searching for. Because he was as short as a child, he had crawled through the hole in the back wall and turned the abandoned house into his temporary hideout. His favorite thing to do was play hide and seek with children, and then harm them in various ways. The most terrifying part, the police still haven't caught him.